Look, the next thing we get them to do is, and this is maybe in no particular order, right? So I'll leave it to you as to what order you do this in, because everyone has their own way of doing things. It's called the emotional projection. And now, what is this emotional projection? Projection means that you can ask a respondent questions, right? And here we do pose questions, but not to the respondent about themselves. Projection means that we get the respondent to talk about other people. And these other people are in the form of pictures or photos, right? Now, personally, I use photographs of people's faces, right? There's a whole reason for that. It's called personality projection. I'm not going to go into it today. If you want to look that up, look it up, Google it. I'm sure you'll find heaps on it. Maybe it doesn't really matter what picture you use, right? But I use pictures of other people's faces because we have a very innate feeling about other people when we look at their face, right? And we ask the respondent, every respondent individually, because the emotional projection actually has to happen at an individual level. So I know we're in a group, right? But at some point in the group, we've got to actually collect information from the individuals in the group, kind of like a structured depth interview, but with a lot of people, right? So this is very, very important. You can't get people's needs in a group answer scenario. People will not talk about their needs, even indirectly, if they have to do it in front of other people. So you've got to do it at an individual level, and you do this by getting them to write stuff down. And you get them to write stuff down, not about themselves, but about this person in the picture. This person in the picture, what brand do they use? What do they do? Who are they? What makes them tick? Now, why do we use projection? Because what people say, what the respondent says about that picture in the group doesn't tell you anything at all about the person in the picture, right? That's just a picture, that's not even a person. It tells you a hell of a lot about the person themselves. You know the old adage, what we say about other people doesn't tell us anything at all about the other person. It tells you a hell of a lot about the person who's doing the talking. And that's exactly the whole point about projection. We can ask questions about the brand, the category, extremely specific questions about, why they use it, in what situations do they use it, what are the deep needs associated. We can ask these questions of the respondents because it's not about them themselves. So they're giving you these wonderful projections about what they feel these people are in the photographs quite freely because they don't think they're talking about themselves, and they're not. But, of course, we know as researchers that they are. So the projection is extremely important. Now, it has to happen on a one-on-one situation because of the issue of subjectivity, right? So let's talk briefly about subjectivity. Now, marketers and researchers, we hate subjectivity because subjectivity threatens our ability to tell the big story, right? And that's what we love to do. We love to construct these big stories and tell these big stories. However, these stories have to be constructed. If you want these stories to resonate and to want these stories to strike emotional chords, the stories actually have to be about the individual's subjective experience. So the stories have to be constructed from many subjective experiences. So, however, what does research usually do? It gets a group of people together and it seeks consensus from the group. So we always say things like, oh, well, what do we all think about this, right? Or what do we all think about that? And we go make sure that everyone has their turn in speaking. But what we're doing is, implicitly manufacturing consensus in the group, which means we are ignoring subjectivity in its true form. Now, the thing is that the best broad cultural portraits are painted only when all subjective experiences are taken into account. Just because we have subjective experiences, it doesn't mean that the underlying needs are vastly different to one another, right? So this is very, very important. Get the subjectivity, get that subjective information out, then you lay it all out, you read it over, you analyse it, and then you will see the patterns emerging from that subjectivity. Remember Kinsey, the guy, the very controversial researcher who documented American sexual practices in the 50s, Kinsey, he did it by painstaking, subjective, individual, one-on-one interviews with thousands of people, and from those thousands of individual experiences, he was able to paint the collective cultural picture of sexual practices in the United States. Right? So that's a very, very powerful and important mechanism we have at our disposal. The subjective experience, but projected. Don't ask the respondent directly about themselves because the guards will come up, the shutters will come up, and we've kind of lost them in a way when that happens. So the emotional projection subjective experience, and because we're in a group, you can't get them to really talk about the projection, so you get them to write it down. So you have these kind of loose questions. I won't go into exactly what those questions are. You have to kind of figure that out in your own way, but it's very important. You get them to write it down, write stuff down. There's subjective projection, you take it away, and then you basically analyse it later on. Now, throughout this process, you say to them, look, I mean, you know, there are no right or wrong answers. We don't know who these people are in the photos. You just got to go with your gut feel. Encourage them to go with their gut feel. You know, follow your mind. Wherever your mind goes, follow it. This is the kind of things that I generally tell them in order to get them to get this information. It's very important that we capture that information. Now, once we've got that information, we've got to analyse it in a very systematic way. I mean, so when I say in a systematic way, I don't mean getting together with your colleagues into a room and say, right, we've all done 2 groups each or whatever, let's whiteboard what we all think has come out of the group. Now, again, this is a controversial thing to say maybe, and I'm sorry to say it, but we are not being paid to write down what we think happened in the group. We are paid to analyse the information that has come out of the group. That's what the job of the researcher is. Right? So that's meaningless to get the impression of the group. What we need to do is to analyse all that information that's been written down very systematically, summarise the information from every respondent, and then start looking for the patterns, constantly looking for the patterns. That's what research is all about, finding patterns in amongst what is seemingly chaotic and disparate information from individuals, you know, all of whom have different needs and personalities and desires and so on. So it's very, very important to actually try and find the patterns. And what you will find is when you start to look for those patterns and analyse them, is that across all those projections you will find a lot of similarities, which means, okay, not completely, because there are different needs, so you're going to develop different kinds of needs for the category, right? So that's fine. But what you'll find is that they will come out quite easily. Now, you'll know that once you find those, you'll realise that you've really hit onto something important, and you hit on something that is very fundamentally important, because everyone was in their own space, writing their own stuff down, looking at different pictures, yet what they're writing down, their subjective experiences have a common nomenclature. That common nomenclature is when we know we've really struck something very, very important as well. Right? So it's an extremely powerful thing to find as well, to do that. You've got to understand that in the group, we call these, you know, and I've called them respondents. And respondents really, I mean, that's a horrible word, isn't it? Because that means that we're giving them questions and we're asking them to respond. And, you know, I mean, that's really demeaning and undermining the consumer, because we've said this before, the consumer is the most important person for your product, not because they buy it, but they might actually not buy it, but the future of your product is contained somewhere in their psyche, right? That's why they're very, very important to us. So let's not call them respondents. I like to call them participants. And I know that sounds crazy and a little bit wanky to basically, oh, let's not call them respondents, let's call them participants. But those words are different words. They mean different things. A respondent is someone who must respond to your questions, like they're serving you, as opposed to a participant, all right, who is participating in their own realisations about themselves, albeit in a kind of an indirect way, if you like. Right, so let's forget about the respondent and the question and the tables and the chairs and all of that sort of stuff, and let's start thinking about participants, participation, activities and realisation. Now, once we start to think about this industry in different words, using different language, then it will become different.